Violence has stopped us in our tracks again. This week we witnessed the worst mass shooting in the history of our country. And our hearts cry out, usually with one word, why? Why? I've been told that word why, when it is spoken in times like these, is not a question. It is a protest. We've had a little time now, about a few days, to let the enormity of what happened to begin to sink in. It's not far away, like Columbine, which happened way before I came here and started my ministry at First Presbyterian. But it's further away still from some of the events that have happened in the 8 years I've been here with you. Charleston and Newtown. San Bernardino. It's not so far away. It's not so close that we can't take it in. It's just here, among us, with us, in our minds, in our hearts. Today we're going to hear a story about the great prophet Elijah. Elijah was a man of God, and when we encounter him today, we will find him running for his life after one of the greatest demonstrations of God's power in the Old Testament. Listen with me to that story in 1 Kings chapter 19. And we will begin with the first verse. Ahab told Jezebel all that Elisha had done and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. And then Jezebel sent messengers to Elijah saying, "So may the gods do to me, and more also, if I do not make my life like the life of one of them, and have you killed by this time tomorrow." Then Elisha was afraid. He got up and he fled for his life and came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah. He left his servant there, but he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a solitary broom tree. He asked that he might die. "It is enough now, O Lord. Take away my life, for I am no better than my ancestors." Then he lay down under the broom tree and fell asleep. Suddenly an angel touched him and said to him, "Get up and eat." He looked, and there at his head was a cake baked on hot stones and a jar of water. He ate and drank and lay down again. The angel of the Lord came a second time, touched him and said, "Get up and eat, otherwise the journey will be too much for you." He got up and ate and drank, and then he went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mount of God. At that place he came to a cave and spent the night there. Then the word of the Lord came to him, saying, "What are you doing here?" He answered, "I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they are seeking my life to take it away." He said, "Go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." Now there was a great wind, so strong that it was splitting the mountains and breaking rocks in pieces before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a sound of sheer silence. When Elisha heard it, he wrapped his face in his mantle and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. Then there came a voice to him and said, "What are you doing here, Elisha?" He answered, "I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they are seeking my life to take it away." Then the Lord said to him, "Go, return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus, and when you arrive, you shall anoint Hazael as king over Aram. Also, you shall anoint Jehu, son of Nimshi, as king over Israel, and you shall anoint Elisha, son of Shaphat, as a prophet in your place." Just a few days before Elijah began to run for his life, there had been a mighty demonstration of God's power. Elisha had challenged all the prophets and priests of Baal to a contest between the God of Israel and the god Baal. So he told the priests of Baal that they should take an altar and put a bull on that altar with wood, and they should call upon their God to come down and to set fire to that sacrifice. So, all day long, 450 priests came and they cried out to Baal, "Please rain fire down on this sacrifice. Please hear our voice." All morning. And there was no answer. So then Elijah began to taunt them and said, "Oh, where is your God? Perhaps he's meditating, or, well, perhaps he's wandered away, or maybe he's asleep." So Elisha let the rest of that day go by, and when night came, he said, "Come closer. I want to show you something." And so he took and repaired the altar of the Lord. He placed wood on it. He placed a bull on it. And then he took water and he started pouring water on the sacrifice. He dug a trench all the way around the altar, and he poured so much water into that space, the altar and the trench, and everything was filled to the brim with water. Then he called upon the Lord. And the Lord came down with a mighty fire, and the fire consumed everything. It consumed the sacrifice, the altar, the dust, the stones, and it even licked up all of that water that was in the trench. There was nothing left. Everyone was terrified. But obviously, Elisha and the God of Israel had prevailed in this contest. And so then Elijah seized all 450 of those priests and he killed them. Now, this did not make Jezebel very happy, and that is why she said that she was going to chase after Elisha and have him killed no matter what. So Elijah ran into the wilderness as far as he could go. Beersheba is the far, far southern portion of the land of Israel. And he went further than that. He went way down, 40 days further into the wilderness. And when we find him, he is a broken man. When we encounter Elisha, he is hiding. He hasn't eaten. He hasn't had anything to drink. He is tired. He is angry. And he is complaining. "Oh Lord, it is enough. I have had enough of this." And he kept that up for quite some time. And then he said the most disturbing thing of all. He said, "I am alone. There is no one else who is trying to support you, O God of Israel. I'm the only one." Have you ever had that feeling of being completely alone? You know, for those of us and you that have enjoyed the experience of being loved, there is something about knowing that, hearing those footfalls on the stair and recognizing whose they are and having your heart beat just a little faster because you know who's coming up the stair. And also knowing when you hear those footfalls and they hear yours, the same is true. There is a special, special place. Even when you are alone, you know that person is holding you dearly, dearly in their heart. You know, there is nothing that is more powerful in curing despair as connection. Connection. Conversation. And so God looked down upon Elisha and he regarded his poor state, and God made contact. God made contact with Elisha, starting with eat. Now you may think that's a strange thing for someone to say to a person who is completely swamped in despair, but I can tell you it is not. People forget to eat. People don't get hungry anymore. People don't eat when they're feeling that badly. And so when God laid out the warm cakes in front of Elisha and said, "Eat," Elisha was reminded to eat and drink. And then what did God do after that? God said, "What are you doing here, Elisha?" And that question opens up for us our lesson for today. What are you doing here, Elisha? Well, when Elisha heard that question, he launched into his litany. And as you noticed as I was reading, it was quite a litany indeed. He talked about how much he had done for the Lord, how he had slain so many people who were trying to damage the reputation of God and tear down. He had been tearing down these idols and for these false gods and working so very, very hard. And now he was left and he was the only one. And what did God do during all of this, shall we say, complaining? God listened. Did God interrupt Elisha? No, God did not. Did God start preaching to Elisha? No. God did not do anything except listen. And God listened until Elijah was completely done with what he had to say. That is the first challenge that we have today in this scripture story. And it is the challenge that this week also presents us. Listening. You know, if I had to sit there and listen to Elisha, let's just say after a couple of minutes, I would probably start to check out. You know, because this stuff is really hard to hear. And after a while, the burden of receiving this pain becomes almost unbearable. It's hard to listen, but can we listen? That's the question. Can we listen to what happened this week? And when we're done listening to that, can we listen to the sound of the voices that have been silenced. And when we have finished listening to their silence and wondering what they might say, can we keep listening and recognize their absence? This is what the scripture story seems to be leading us to do. So God, after listening to Elijah's litany, now remember, God has not made any response yet. God said, "Come with me, Elijah, over to the cleft of the rock." And so Elisha went over to the cleft of the rock. So I invite you to come over to the cleft of the rock with me, and we're going to sit in a little spot where we can see very far, but we are protected because of the cleft of the rock, and wait for God to speak to us about our litany, or let's say Elijah's litany. Well, the first thing that happens is a huge wind comes up. I mean, it's gigantic. It's the kind of wind that scares the daylights out of you. And it is pouring through the mountain and the valley. And then it stops. Was God in the wind? No. After that, there's a huge earthquake, and you can feel the earth shuddering underneath you, and you know what it's like to be in an earthquake, or I do. And you never know what's going to fall, what's going to happen. And the earthquake keeps shaking away, and then it stops. Was God in the earthquake? No. After that, a fire broke out on the mountain, and the mountain was all aflame. All around you, except where you were, you see fire, and then it stops. Was God in the fire? No. So, are you still up there with me? Are you still hanging around in the cleft of the rock? I'm telling you, I would have probably left by now, because I would be telling myself, well, okay, wind, fire, earthquake, those are the usual things. Obviously, God is not going to show up today. Maybe some other day I'll come around, but I'm asking you to stay just a little bit longer, as Elijah did. And what did he hear? And what did he see? The sound of sheer silence. And there's one thing you can say about Elijah, the man of God. He knew when God was there, because he wrapped his mantle over his head and he bowed down. He knew it was God. God in the silence. And then after that, remember now, God hasn't even said anything yet. God says, "So, Elisha, I have work for you to do. I want you to go out and anoint 3 people. 3 new leaders for Israel." Now today, as we reflect upon our days, our fiery mountains that we've experienced, I invite you to imagine that the behavior of God toward Elisha is the behavior that we should have toward one another. When I was reading this passage this week in light of what's happened to all of us, I stumbled over something. And it was this. I began to wonder if, that big demonstration that Elijah put on to prove that the God of Israel was the best God, the fire and such, and then the slaying of all the 450 priests, I began to wonder if that was really something that God wanted to be done, or maybe I wasn't sure. For the first time, I've never questioned that before. So I began to wonder if perhaps what the reason Elijah ran away was because, well, let's just say the consequences of his actions were catching up with him. Maybe the violence was not something that God really wanted in this instance. Now, I'm saying this to you with great trepidation, because if there are any biblical scholars in the room, you may take me out after the sermon if you wish. Because I can tell you that the people that Elisha anointed, they were violent people too. The king that he anointed, he was violent. And Elisha, the successor to Elijah, well, let's just say that one day when a few children decided to make fun of him, he went and he cursed them, and a she-bear came out of the woods, and 42 of them were mauled. Okay? So let's say that violence does not disappear just because Elisha was told to put away his sword on this occasion. You know, when I read stories like that, I think to myself, am I reading the newspaper or am I reading the Bible here? Because some of the stories in the Bible sound like they belong in the newspaper. But I will tell you this, the Bible has got everything in it. All of human experience right here. I don't understand all of it. But the one thing that I did understand this week is that we should behave the way God behaved toward Elisha in the wake of this terrible tragedy. We must listen, especially to the people with whom we disagree. I think Elisha was pretty disagreeable when he was screaming and hollering at God. But God did not give up on him. No. We have to listen to a person's story, past the disagreements, all the way to where that story ends, in the core of that person's life. And if we do not take time to listen, if we rush into condemnation, which is so easy to do, or judgment, which is also easy to do, if we skip over that hard listening, we will get the same results that we have been getting for the past 8 years and beyond since I've been minister here. It's the listening that we haven't done. And it's the listening that we are called to do. And it's really, really hard. But only by listening to each other can we then decide to act. And when we decide to act, then we can act together because we have heard one another. And perhaps what we might do, it might even be something like what Elisha did. Put away those swords, especially the word ones, that cut people down with a single word or sentence. And get out the oil and anoint the next generation to lead. And teach them what we're trying so desperately to learn in these violent times. Teach them what we did right and what we did wrong. Bless them. And remember that God will equip all of us. We are God's people. We must stand in the face of days like this. We can't let these violent episodes go unacknowledged, unquestioned. But we also must listen. We must act. We must stand. We must speak. But first, we must listen. God is depending on us.